mileage compensation. Usually we get mileage compensation. You're plus on.
Oh, I guess. So not a give you like
It's like say it's like 50 cents per mile.
What are you planning to do for grad school?
Like, and then you-
What are you planning to do? Okay. Oops. Created by attendance.
I don't get in.
Okay. All right. So when we talked last time, we were talking about how to tell apart dinosaurs from things that are not dinosaurs by looking at their hips. And we learned to tell apart our two main groups of dinosaurs, the Saurischian dinosaurs and the Ornithischian dinosaurs. Okay, so now we're going to focus in on one of those two groups, and then on Friday we'll talk about the other one. Okay. So we're going to start with our Saurischian dinosaurs. So here we see a dinosaur timeline so we can get an overview of what dinosaur diversity looked like across the Mesozoic. So during the Triassic, we have some dinosaurs starting out. We can see that they're much smaller than we typically think of dinosaurs. So here's our scale bar of a meter or about 3 feet. So we can see we start with some pretty tiny dinosaurs, and they don't get really large until we move into the Jurassic and then as we move forward in time. And there aren't quite as many of them. We don't have that many examples this far back in time. Okay. As we move into the Jurassic and then especially into the Cretaceous, we start to see a lot of diversity here. So if you have a favorite dinosaur, does anybody have a favorite dinosaur?
Is the dodo bird considered a dinosaur?
I guess technically, since it's a bird, that's your favorite? Yeah. Okay.
I really like the Triceratops.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. I just really want to ride the Brachiosaurus, right? I feel like the really large ones wouldn't even notice me. You know, the small ones are like the size of an elephant. Pretty cool. Yeah, so we got lots of famous dinosaurs and some not so famous ones. Okay. So remembering where we are, we're within Archosaurs. Now we are moving into our dinosaurs themselves, which is a group that actually does include birds. And fun fact, the way that they actually define dinosaurs is by taking modern birds like a pigeon or something, then taking a Triceratops traditionally and calculating back to the last common ancestor of those two things to kind of find the base. So early in time, they have a bunch of things that they call like dinosauromorpha, which means like dinosaur shaped. So sometimes things that look like a dinosaur early in time don't quite get included in this group. It might be like a little outgroup kind of to the side, depending on that analysis of similarities on either side of this tree. So that's kind of why the Triceratops and the bird are positioned where they are on this image. Although with some of the newer potential rearrangements to the phylogeny of dinosaurs, they're kind of playing with whether they really want to keep that definition exactly. Specifically, they're planning to, in those analyses, grab some species other than Triceratops because of the sort of like new potential nesting in the dinosaurs in terms of like where these get positioned. It would kick some things out depending on whether those new phylogenies are accurate. But this is typically what they do. So we're gonna start with what we can guess about the ancestral condition of our dinosaurs. So like what the oldest ones would have looked like way back in the Triassic. So one of the oldest fossils that we have for dinosaurs, it's an example, is something called Eoraptor. So this is found in Argentina. I think it was actually found in 1991, but our citation here is from 1993. Sometimes it takes people a while to write a paper. Sometimes paleontologists get annoyed at each other for how long exactly it takes them to write a paper. Heard people take like 10 years and everybody knows that there was a big discovery and nothing has been published and nothing has been published. So scientists procrastinate too, like a fair bit. Okay, so here we have Eoraptor, and this one actually is in the Triassic. You can get a sense of the size here based on what we've used for scaling. So this is a pretty small dinosaur, about 3 feet long, including the tail, I believe, maybe 25 pounds. So here we have it compared to legs. Here we have it compared to a mouse. So this is not a big, intimidating giant. And a lot of the other animals around in the Triassic would have been bigger than Eoraptor. Doesn't mean dwarf thief, partially because of that size. Raptor, I guess, must mean thief because that's in a lot of other names of our dinosaurs. And actually, I found a review of some of these early dinosaurs as like, when I quoted it later, like off-brand raptors from Jurassic Park, right? So they do look kind of like our later groups, which is part of why we're starting with the Saurischians instead of the Ornithischians, because we can see a lot of the similarities kind of following through here. Okay, so it's small. One of the things that we look at, right, our teeth as we go through our dinosaurs and animals in general, if we're trying to think about things about their behavior, because teeth can tell you about what they ate. So we'll see a picture on the next couple slides kind of comparing more teeth. So we know that our dinosaurs all would have had decudont dentition, meaning those teeth are in tooth sockets. We have a new tooth word here saying that Eoraptor had heterodont dentition. So hetero means like different. So all this is saying is that Eoraptor had different types of teeth. So as I was looking through the literature, different people have different ideas about exactly what Eoraptor would have eaten. But the implication of having different types of teeth is that you can eat different types of things with those teeth. When we see really specialized animals that eat just one kind of thing, their teeth all tend to look pretty much the same, either adapted for like piercing and cutting, right? Usually we see that in carnivores, or when we have herbivores, we see teeth that are really adapted for grinding and chewing and processing plant materials, and they have like a lot of cellulose and things you have to kind of break down in order to be able to get nutrition from that material. And you yourself have heterodont dentition, right? You have different types of teeth, right? You have biting teeth, like for biting something in the front, right? You got your incisors, you got your canines, and in the back you have your molars, where you really do the grinding and chewing of food, which is a specialization. You I've never necessarily watched a croc eat, right? But like you can imagine, right? Some animals just got up and down and don't grind their food and chew, and those tend to be our carnivores. I think, does anybody have a cat? How does your cat eat?
They like they're cool. They like to.
They go kind of like,
They eat like dogs. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess.
yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm asking because cats are obligate carnivores, like they have to eat meat,
Yeah.
specifically. So you wouldn't expect them to be like holding something in their cheek.
They're always like, I don't know, they just always like look down. I don't.
I think you haven't carefully observed their mouth and their teeth while they're eating. That's fair. Okay. So here we can see some of the teeth of the Eoraptor. So here's a comparison of diet and tooth shape. in dinosaurs specifically. So what this is showing us, those colors, took me a second when I pulled this image to figure out where the colors were, but they're in these rows, right? So what we're looking at this top row, highlighted in pink, those are the carnivorous dinosaurs, their teeth. Then we have insectivores, so things eating insects next down. We got some omnivores, so things that will eat everything. Herbivores eating plants. And durophagous means like eating really hard things. So like hyenas eat bones, right? So think something like that, right? Like breaking down something really, really hard to eat. So you can see how up at the top here with our carnivorous dinosaur teeth, we have these really sharp, curved kind of edges. And this rainbow kind of scale bar is showing you basically where the teeth are kind of hardest. It's showing like stress patterns within the teeth when it would kind of bite. So you can see how it has these kind of hardened edges at the tips and along the sides, kind of acting as blades or scissors kind of for cutting stuff up. Versus when we look at our herbivores, we have a couple that have pointy tips with stresses, but we have kind of more even distribution of those stresses across the teeth. Okay, so Eoraptor would have had some teeth that looked a bit like the carnivores, but then it also would have had teeth that looked like some of these other categories because it didn't have the same tooth type throughout its mouth. As we go through, today we're talking about the saurischians. So we're going to see that that includes both the theropods and the sauropods. So they actually have different types of teeth within these two groups. So we can take a look at those right now. We're going to see that our theropods include really our big kind of carnivores. So like T-Rex is going to be a theropod. You can see that curved kind of pointy form. The sauropods are mostly herbivores, possibly all herbivores. I don't know if I've heard of a carnivorous sauropod, but I don't want to say there isn't one. But you can see they have a different tooth shape. It is still kind of pointy, but there are differences to it. And people who are really interested in teeth have studied them in detail and talked about why exactly this would have been useful for herbivory. Next time we'll talk about the ornithischians, and you can see that they have a much different tooth form in this group that's essentially more distantly related to these two groups of saurischian dinosaurs that we're talking about today. The other thing that's helpful when we look at these oldest forms of dinosaur is looking at their locomotion, so like how they moved. So when we reconstruct Eoraptor, so we put it back together, figure out how those bones should go together, figure out how everything should be positioned, right? We can see that that forelimb, that arm structure is much shorter. We have a much longer hind limb. Like this animal was not down on all fours, right? We also have trackways from Eoraptor, I believe, which also helps us look at physically what limbs are touching the ground. And also they do experiments for trackway analyses on different types of material, like what do tracks look like on sand? What do tracks look like in mud? How fast does something have to be running to produce tracks that look like that? So you can actually tell a fair bit about movement from those trackways. And some of the studies are pretty funny. A friend of mine, I think, was partially working on this, and I think partially she was looking at the spines of things, but they took a bunch of turkeys and they were like running them on treadmills in all sorts of conditions stuff to analyze how they moved, to kind of compare back to what different fossils might have been doing. And I think I saw someone had built like a dinosaur robot and was making it walk across all sorts of different ground, sand, dirt, clay, gravel. So people do some silly and really fun seeming stuff to try and figure out how to interpret the scale that we have left. Okay. So it's bipedal, which is why we think of the oldest dinosaurs and the ancestors of dinosaurs as being bipedal. We think it was pretty fast, partially based on those trackways, and partially based on its like long kind of streamlined form. It also has basically some hollow places in its bones that would have made it lighter and therefore more agile and able to move quickly. We can also see, based on its bones, that it would have walked on its toes. So like kind of tiptoeing along and kind of bouncing off those toes. So doing that is called digitigrade. So digits are like fingers and toes. So it's walking on its toes here. They're kind of springing along, running around, small looking thing. Probably did a fair amount of meat eating, but could have eaten other things as well. So we think this is that basal condition.
What would have been like the meat that they were eating? Like,
yeah, I saw different suggestions kind of all over the place, to be honest. But
what type of meat like really on the planet at the time?
yeah,
Like
we have some like very large insects at the time. So like in this time period, like insectivore doesn't necessarily mean eating like tiny little flies. Because remember we saw how big those giant dragonflies were. So maybe insects. I saw some scavenging. We also have our early mammal relatives, and we have other reptiles that aren't this around. So things like that, essentially. Yeah. Yeah, it's not just dinosaurs, and because this is in the Triassic, it's like mostly not dinosaurs. So bouncy little Eoraptor. Okay. So Eoraptor is going to take us into the Saurischians, and depending on the analysis, right, it might have been already kind of partway down this line. I think it's somewhere near the last common ancestor, but a lot of those traits do look more like some of the dinosaurs that we're going to get into today. And that could kind of be for two reasons, right? When we think about how groups break off from each other, could be that these are specializations that lead us into the Saurischians, but it could also be that the Ornithischians or other groups are developing new derived traits, and the Saurischians are kind of keeping some of those ancestral traits, right? So that's why there's a little bit of kind of wiggle room about exactly where this should go based on those common traits. Okay. So when we were identifying the Saurischians last time, we were identifying them largely based on their pelvis, and especially based on the form of that pubis at the front was one of our really identifying characteristics, telling them apart from Ornithischians. So we can tell it's a dinosaur because it's got a hole all the way through at the hip joint. So that acetabulum has a perforation, this hole. And that pubis was pointing, imagine the front of the dinosaur over here, pointing forwards, has this kind of boot-like prong on the end. And we saw that it really kind of forms a joint decently well with the other side. Within the Saurischians, we're going to have two lineages, so two family groups, essentially. We're going to have the sauropods and then the theropods. And the theropods are getting us pretty close to the birds. So this is where we have the birds arising, is out of the theropods. So we're going to start to see bird-like looking characteristics in that group. And sometimes when you read about theropods, it's going to specify that these are non-avian ones that they're talking about, because otherwise we're just talking about bird ancestors, which we'll address kind of separately. Okay. So we're going to talk about these theropods first. So here's some of our diversity of theropod dinosaurs, and we're just going to go through a couple of them, but we can see that there are some little ones, but the little ones compared to a human still seem rather large. There'll be a couple of small ones, but we also have some really large kind of apex predators. So here you see a Gigantosaurus, which was gigantic. And you can get a sense of the like general shape of a theropod dinosaur looking at some of these images. Some of them start to look pretty bird-like. So you can also see that relationship to our avian dinosaurs in some of these images. Okay. So part of where we're starting here, our oldest dinosaurs look kind of like our Saurischians, and as far as we can tell, I think that we start to see a greater prevalence of the theropod dinosaurs kind of earlier. So this is from that paleo database that we played around with a while back at the end of class one day. So we pulled up a map here of the geography in the Triassic period. And I put on all of our dinosaurs at the time. So you can see the distribution of our different dinosaur groups early in their evolution. We've got in the Triassic, about half of the examples here in this database are theropods specifically. We've got another 40-ish% of them that are generically just kind of Saurischians, right? We got a little asterisk there on that. 5% of them, they just have them like within the group dinosaurs, not really specified. And our ornithischians like are not really prevalent yet during this time period. We're going to see that even some of our group of Saurischians are not really present in the Triassic, but we do see some things that seem quite clearly theropod-like. I also pulled up where these sites would be on a current world map. So you can see here where we currently have good fossil sites. So in the US, we've got really good dinosaur fossil sites out west. And in the 1800s, there was pretty intense competition about who could find the most, the biggest, the newest dinosaurs, all kind of focused on these Western exposures in the Western states, trying to find all of these dinosaurs. It got pretty combative, and there are some depictions in like novels, and I think there are even movies about two specific paleontologists who were really kind of at war about finding dinosaurs in the West, which is kind of funny. You can see that we have a couple kind of on the East Coast. So in our video that we watched last time, I think we watched the video last time, it mentioned my home state of New Jersey. I have never found a dinosaur in New Jersey, but maybe when I'm home for Thanksgiving, I'll try and go out in the woods and see what I can dig up. We also have good dinosaur sites in Argentina. Fun fact, I once went to a dinosaur conference in Berlin when I was a brand new grad student, just because I wanted to go and see what it was like. And also my sister lives in Berlin. And at about 4 a.m., I convinced some dinosaur paleontologist that next time he went to Argentina on a dinosaur dig, I would pay my ticket and he would let me come dig dinosaurs. I did not follow up on that. But maybe I still will. We'll see. But good place to look for dinosaurs. They have some similar kind of geology. So we find a lot of fossil sites in like badlands type environments. Have any been to the badlands in the US? Yeah. You want to describe what it looked like?
It's essentially like when you drive through a bunch of hills, like over and over, but like it's tiny little gaps.
Yeah.
And like you can see like layers.
Yeah. And that's why it's so good, right? So you have a lot of surface exposed, like not a lot of plant life, I assume, right? Occasionally it'll bloom with like sedges and like, what is it, sage and small stuff. But for the most part, it's like kind of deserty looking, but it's got all these outcroppings and like canyons and cliff type stuff that wear away and let stuff poke through from the different layers. So that's really good for finding fossils. We also have sites in Europe. I think that may be partially by virtue of just people looking in Europe for a long time. We have a lot of good fossil sites in general coming out in China these days. So not particularly right here for our Triassic dinosaurs, but there are some really incredible paleontological sites that have been reported here in the past decade or two, I'm going to say. Yeah. So scattered throughout, see them in some other places. But if you want to plan vacations around finding dinosaur fossils, these are some places you could go look. And we'll look in a little bit at this distribution on Pangaea. So this is our supercontinent, basically. At this point, we see everything kind of mashed together. But we can see that we have dinosaurs in both the northern and the southern hemisphere. We're kind of missing a big swath near the equator. Okay. So at the end of the Triassic, we do have an extinction event. So Triassic starts with an extinction and then ends with an extinction. And it's really that extinction at the end of the Triassic, so between the Triassic and the Jurassic periods, that really allows dinosaurs to explode and take over the world. Earlier in time, like during the Triassic, we have other reptiles as our dominant life forms, as well as some of our synapsids, so relatives of mammals, extinct relatives of mammals. One of the really recent ideas about why that might be is this distribution of the dinosaurs on Pangaea during that time and what that maybe means about their adaptations or some of their adaptations. So you can see that we have a bunch of dinosaurs up here in our northern latitudes, and we also have a collection of dinosaurs down here way south in our southern latitudes. And some recent research indicates that there were dinosaurs living in parts of the Earth and parts of these continents where it actually did literally freeze, right? So we have seasonality, and they were able to withstand really cold temperatures, potentially at least some of them. So at the end of the Triassic, when we have an extinction event, right, a lot of our extinctions have to do with temperature and glaciation. So part of this recent paper that I pulled up suggests that some of their success may have to do with these adaptations that they might already have had to living in cold conditions. So when glaciers come in, the planet cools for a little while, they can survive that because they were already adapted to those conditions near the poles, basically. And there's back and forth about exactly what the like thermoregulatory capabilities of dinosaurs would have been. So basically, reptiles are cold-blooded, right? They have to kind of like lay in the sun to keep themselves warm. We're warm-blooded as mammals. So exactly how dinosaurs were controlling their temperatures, there are some fiddly details and it's ongoing research. But basically, it just kind of suggests that they did have the ability to keep themselves warm, right? And would have had some aspect of being warm-blooded in order to like withstand those cold temperatures. Okay, so that kind of helps them potentially survive this extinction event and take over the Earth. Yep. So over time, we're still looking here at the theropods. You can see that during the Jurassic, we start to see more of them. They really survived more in these northern latitudes. We still see some in the Jurassic in the southern hemisphere, but we got lots more dots up here at the top. And then as we move into the Cretaceous, they're really expanding their ranges significantly, in addition to expanding kind of species and types of dinosaurs that we're going to see. One of the ideas about why we see all these different species coming out of these groups is the breakup of Pangaea and the continents kind of separating, right? So we start to have more reproductive isolation, right? And as these groups get isolated from each other, we don't have genes moving back and forth between groups. That also helps us diversify different groups, spread apart and start to look different, in addition to having different groups adapting to different spaces in the environment, right? So different ecological niches for the groups that are in the same places. So we can see that happening over the course of the Mesozoic. So when we're looking at the theropods, you can see images like this that are picking out some of the characteristics that you would expect to see in theropods. Like some of these drawings for children, like really actually get the point home quite well, right? So we're going to see that they're carnivorous and have large teeth specialized for carnivorous diets, although not all theropods were carnivorous. There's a tendency, and when we see carnivorous dinosaurs, they really do tend to be theropods. They're going to have shorter arms, they're going to have a big tail, they're going to have longer back legs. Here's some more specificity about some specific bones. I think this one was my favorite. This is specifically pointing out some of the characteristics on Allosaurus, one of our theropods that looks almost kind of like our Tyrannosaurus dinosaurs, or Tyrannosaurid. So we're looking and zooming in at some of those characteristics. So looking at those teeth, I looked at a diagram of different teeth for different habitats, different diet, and we can see that the theropods, in addition to having like pointy curved teeth, they're actually serrated, so like a serrated knife. So they're going to have sharp edges with little points for cutting. This allows them to really slice into meat well. They do have these short, small arms. So like our Eoraptor and our early dinosaurs, kind of at the base of the tree, we're going to expect them to be bipedal. So you can see that this Allosaurus is depicted just the same way we were talking about Eoraptor. So it's standing on its hind legs. In fact, it's standing on its toes here. The toes themselves and those hands are clawed, and they start to have really just bird-like feet with 3 main toes. In some of our groups, we're going to have that even further reduced, so fewer and fewer digits. And we can see that these toes are pretty narrow. We're getting a kind of narrow, specialized foot for walking on at the back here, with a more kind of grasping, smaller arm in front. We can also see that we have a long, stiff tail. They were pretty kind of skinny. So using this for balance in part, right? Because we do see that they're holding their vertebral column, so their spine, still mostly kind of parallel to the ground, at least in this image, right? So if you're leaning forward, you have to do to like fight something, right? You're not going down on your hands because you're a biped. You need something to balance. So the idea is in part that the tail was able to swing and counterbalance that weight. So using it for that. And we can see that in the narrow tail vertebrae that these would have been stiff and kind of whip-like. We have a couple of famous examples. We've got lots of theropod dinosaurs, but some of our most famous dinosaurs go within this group. So the Tyrannosaurids and therefore Tyrannosaurus Rex go in this group, the theropods. Here's some other Tyrannosaur family members. So Tyrannosaurus Rex is not the only one. And in fact, one recent group of paleontologists suggested that Tyrannosaurus Rex is actually 3 different species. That is an argument people are having, but we can see characteristics of our Saurischian dinosaurs here. So we see that big flat ilium. Here we see that pubis with the peg on the front, joining together with the opposite side, so we can easily tell that these Tyrannosaurids are in that group of Saurischian dinosaurs. We can see these very pointy, sharp, ripping looking teeth, giving us one of our theropod characteristics. You can see these shortened forelimbs. We can even see that they actually just have 2 fingers here. Right? We can see those narrowed digitigrade feet. And we can see that stiff tail at the back here. Okay. So the Tyrannosaurs get really big. They get bigger over time. So our larger members tend to be more in the Cretaceous, more of our recent members. They do become the dominant large predators, especially in the northern hemisphere. Our tyrannosaurs are found within a larger group of dinosaurs called the coelurosaurs. Coelurosaurs. Sorry, coelurosaurs. I've never actually thought about what that would sound like out loud, which is kind of cool because the coelurosaurs are one of the groups that we have evidence of feathers in, basically, which doesn't necessarily mean, right, that T-Rex was covered in tons of feathers and could like flap around and fly. But overall, some of the Tyrannosaurs probably did have something that looks on its way to feathers, which also is reflective of that relationship of the theropods to modern birds, so to our avian dinosaurs. Now, these early feathers weren't really full feathers. When we think about a feather in the modern day, it has a very specific structure. As you know, like a midrib, it has little branching points off of it. We have different types of feathers on birds. They have downy feathers, and then they have their feathers on the outside, kind of protecting them. They have wing feathers. They're actually quite complicated. What we see in the coelurosaurs are not usually like that. We have more evidence for just like basically hair-like feathers. They're generally referred to as filamentous, right? So kind of like long squiggly looking things. So more kind of like down than what you think of when you think of finding a bird feather on the ground. And we also don't see them all over the body. So we're not thinking just a giant chicken or giant chickadee, but we do tend to see them in like specific spots. Like we're going to see a bunch of leg feathers. I've pulled some fossils out that have rather more feathers on the next couple of slides. So we think that rather than using them for flying initially, that part of this might have been for thermoregulation, right? So you've noticed that when you're cold, right, you get goosebumps. Have you ever thought about like why that is? You're kind of like fluffing up your fur, actually, right? Like you don't have that much fur, right? So there's not really anything to fluff up. But if you think about like when you're going out in the cold, right, they tell you not to wear like really tight boots, right? You're supposed to have air in your boot, right? Leave space to kind of keep that space warm. And it's partially the air being insulated and warmed around you that keeps you warm. All right, so when your hairs stand up, right, you're making a little kind of air layer under it to keep you warm. So we think that these proto feathers might have had a function kind of like that, potentially, at least in some of our groups of dinosaurs. Now, you asked about the tiny arms on the T-Rex, right? When we were talking at the beginning. Yeah. So theropods in general do have shorter arms, but our tyrannosaurs especially have like really tiny arms, like tiny arms that can't necessarily even reach the mouth, right? So while in our theropods more generally, we think about these forelimbs as grasping prey, right? And helping you catch things. If you're catching things with arms that can't reach your mouth, that doesn't really make much sense as a adaptation for feeding, right? So there are various suggestions out there. Some of them have just been like for pushing away from other animals. If you're in like a giant scavenging kind of like feeding pile, just like shoving other animals away. But honestly, the one that I find most convincing, and I think most paleontologists probably find quite convincing, even if they don't want to publicly like say it all the time, right? Is part of the idea is that these may have been for things like mating, right? Like actually holding on to another dinosaur during mating, right? The arms would have been enough for that, for like kind of stabilization. So that is a going theory for what the T-Rex's short arms is my answer to you. So here we're looking at some feathers in other coelosaurs, so not in Tyrannosaurus, but this is why we're now depicting dinosaurs with feathers. So you can see that we've got bones here more in this yellow color, but you can see this black stuff around the edges. It's clearly not rock. The surrounding rock has a different color to it. And you can see these impressions of these filamentous structures around the dinosaur. So this is a small one. This one would have been like chicken sized. Here we see a juvenile Sinornithosaurus. So presumably from China. They nicknamed this guy Dave, apparently. So here we see some of those same filamentous structures. I'm not certain that this is from a coelosaur, but they've actually even found these fossil structures found trapped in amber. So you can really see how this is looking quite feathery, right? So not really a hair. So we find these literal feathers on a dinosaur. You can see on these various images how we have those distributed. So it's not like necessarily all along the body, although this example I picked, I wanted the feathers to be clear, so I picked one with lots of feathers, so we can see kind of a ridge of them down the spine and down the tail. Some of our other groups, we're going to see a bunch on the legs. We think some of these other groups were using them for display in addition to warmth, depending on how big the feathers are, where we see them, right? So when we see leg feathers, doesn't really seem like keeping your ankles warm would necessarily be super important, right? So we have to come up with other explanations. And that's kind of an idea because since birds are dinosaurs and they do all sorts of very weird, very funny mating dances using their feathers. Part of the idea is that some of that behavior might be ancestral. Okay. Another famous example of a theropod dinosaur is the Velociraptor. So this is a genus of theropod dinosaurs that's also in this Coelurosaur group. They're definitely not as big as they're often depicted. Found that they're roughly the size of like a turkey, so could still be scary if they came after you in a large group, but not so much Jurassic Park sized hunting. We can see that they have a bunch of feathers depicted on them here because they're in this Coelurosaur group, right? So we expect that they may have had a fair number of feathers, actually. We do think that they were predators, and large reason for that is that we've found a velociraptor literally fighting another dinosaur. So here's a fossil assemblage they found in the 70s in the Gobi Desert. So here we see a velociraptor on top. Right, so we can see that long, skinny tail. We can see those claws on the feet. Some of our characteristics of this group of dinosaurs. This other one here is a Protoceratops. So think like a basal kind of form of a Triceratops, something like that. So that's going to be from our other big group of dinosaurs, the Ornithischians. It's an herbivorous dinosaur, right? So we have a velociraptor dying fighting this other dinosaur. So that feels like decently clear evidence of predatory behavior, right? Like that's a real see it to believe it kind of thing. So this is one of the groups that we think possibly had feathers in part for display. So you can see those leg feathers there. All right, next example is Oviraptor. Yeah, I doubted myself for a second, but Oviraptor, his name means egg thief. So when they discovered Oviraptor, they found it sitting on top of a nest, right? They recognize, right? This is a Saurischian dinosaur. We can see that clearly, and we can tell it's a theropod. We can tell it's in that theropod group, which is why we give it this raptor name. So when they found it sitting and kind of crouched over a group of eggs, they originally thought that those eggs belonged to the herbivorous Protoceratops. So the interpretation here was that it was on top of these eggs, literally stealing them. But then, more recently, they were able to look inside the egg. Right, so they actually found inside some of these eggs fossil Oviraptor embryos, which is so cool to me, right? They found an embryo dinosaur inside the eggs. So Oviraptor really got a bad rap initially there because this was probably a decent parent, right? So it was literally on top of its own nest, likely brooding, right? Protecting those little baby Oviraptors. We're going to watch a video about that confusion.
Led an expedition to the Gobi Desert of Mongolia in search of human origins. That particular quest ended up going unfulfilled. But Andrews and his team did find something pretty spectacular. Instead of early humans, the rocks of the Gobi yielded a trove of dinosaur fossils, including the world's first recognized dinosaur eggs. The fossils confirmed that dinosaurs, like birds and reptiles, laid eggs. But one of the more interesting specimens was a small bird-like theropod dinosaur whose skull was found right on top of a nest of eggs that were believed to belong to a pancake dinosaur. It appeared to be a thief caught in the act of taking the eggs of another dinosaur. When these fossils were sent back to the American Museum of Natural History in 1924, another paleontologist, Henry Fairfield Osborne, described the dinosaur and gave it the name Oviraptor, or egg thief. But Osborne had doubts about Oviraptor's alleged behavior. It would be decades before the case of the dinosaur egg thief was killed. But what it was, those new investigations would help reinvent how we thought about them. It would show that they weren't old, unfeeling reptiles. At least some of them were social bird-like animals. And instead of being the nightmarish nest robbers that they were thought to be, dinosaurs like Oviraptor would reveal themselves to be caring parents, so dedicated to their offspring that they sometimes try to protect their young to the very end. In the early days of paleontology, we didn't know much about the parenting habits of any of non-alien dinosaurs. That's mainly because there weren't any recognized dinosaur eggs in the fossils, or even fossils of baby dinosaurs in the nest. Some researchers, like Osborne, suspected that dinosaurs probably cared for their young a lot like birds do. And species that do this use a strategy called K-selection. This is where a parent uses its energy to ensure that its few offspring survive the early stages of development. But many other paleontologists thought dinosaurs were more like some kind of food plants. This giving the offspring strategy is known as R-selection. Instead of using a lot of energy to make sure that one or just a few offspring survive, parents use that energy to produce many more offspring at once. They're pretty selective that at least one will make. And the expeditions to Mongolia in the early 20th century provided more insights into which strategy dinosaurs might have used. And after planning for this, It would take about 5 decades before new discoveries would make experts rethink what actually happened at that site. In 1978, just outside of Shogo, Montana, not far from where I am now, a series of small dinosaur bones were found. And they weren't just any little bones. They were the first ever fossils of baby dinosaurs found in a nest. There were more than 10 of them, just over a half-meter long. They were all in a big oval-shaped nest. The teeth of these baby dinos showed a considerable amount of wear, which suggested they were already big. And the bones, while still unfused, were sturdy enough to have allowed them to go outside the nest. So those clues suggested that these baby dinosaurs weren't newborns. They'd actually been in the nest for some time after hatching. And if they stayed in the nest after they hatched, that would mean that something had to have been taken care of. So this new dinosaur was given the name Maiasaurus, the twin mother of the group. Now paleontologists have direct evidence of dinosaur parental care, caring for their offspring after they hatched, much like birds do today. This discovery is part of the dinosaur renaissance that started in the late 1960s, which we talked about before. It caused paleontologists to rethink how they interpreted dinosaur social behavior, not as slow, limited, solitary reptiles, but as smart, active animals. And it was during this time that scientists started to rethink what communities about overlap. Do you know what was terrible? Specifically, the Maniraptor, which is a group of dinosaurs that includes modern birds. And since it was part of that branch of the dino family tree, paleontologists began to question how bird-like they really were in terms of behavior. So in the 1990s, the American Museum of Natural History finally returned to the Gobi Desert. They found the evidence that would exonerate the alleged fake news. A series of expeditions brought back a variety of new fossils. Among them, an egg very similar to the one originally found with Overland. But this egg was getting close to hatching and preserved the bones of the baby inside. And it turns out the embryo was not a Protoceratops, as they expected. Instead, the bones were a baby Oviraptor, meaning that the eggs from the Gobi expedition were also Oviraptor. So the original specimen of Oviraptor that was found on that nest, it wasn't trying to steal the egg, it was trying to protect them. Oviraptor wasn't an egg thief. It was actually a parent that was dedicated enough to die while trying to protect its offspring from sandstorm or flood or maybe a sand perhaps. So Henry Fairfield Osborn was right about the name that he gave Oviraptor, which means he was also wrong to have called it that in the first place. And since then, more specimens from the same family of Oviraptor have been found. They've been key to our understanding of dinosaur parenting. During that same expedition to the Gobi, another relative of Oviraptor was found, named Sadie Cat, and it showed just how close dinosaurs were to birds in their parenting behavior. The specimen was about 70 million years old. It was given the nickname Big Old because it sounds to be this was discussed because of how it was positioned on the egg. Its body was in the center, with the egg surrounding it in circular pattern. Wider ends of the egg were all pointed toward the center of the nest. Dinosaurs forward were spread out, covering the egg with its segment. And the eggs closest to the body now touching the dinosaur's gastroma, whose bones hung on the belly of some reptile, suggesting that the dinosaur kept them right next to the nest. This is very similar to the behavior seen in modern birds called brooding, which birds use their body heat and feathers to bait and protect the egg from the nest. Fossils like the one at Big Mama that directly depict the behavior are really rare. But since its discovery, other specimens of the same family of Oviraptor eggs have been found to also show signs of brooding. While it's still being debated, there's some evidence that suggests the brooders of these eggs would not have been mothers, but fathers. In 2008, a study collected a bunch of data on dinosaur body sizes, as well as the number of eggs they typically had in each bunch. The study then compared that data with the same info from different groups of living archosaurs, the group that includes birds, non-avian dinosaurs, and also all archosaurs. In some of the archosaurs they used were maternal, meaning that parenting was done by females, and some were paternal, or dancing. The results showed that dinosaurs like Oviraptor and Sigacati line up closely with birds that display paternal care, like emus and most of their close relatives. Another study also showed that three dinosaurs didn't have medullary bones. Type of bones that she found in populating female birds that remained for a short time after the medullary. So again, experts are still arguing about this, but there's some evidence that suggests dinosaurs found in those nests were probably male. If true, this might mean that Oviraptor and his relatives were good father lizards. That's for the win. Over the last century or so, while Oviraptor has gone from potential egg thief to potential father, we've also learned more about the origins of parental behavior. Some archosaurs, like crocodilians, have been shown to exhibit genital parenting. But the behavior that we associate with birds, like brooding and long-term care of their young, seems to have originated with non-avian dinosaurs. So it's time to exonerate Oviraptor. And while we're at it, we should probably change the name. Instead of egg thief, might I suggest whatever the Latin is for dinosaur dad? Rename Oviraptor.
So we're going to take a quick look at our other group of Saurischian dinosaurs. we're going to skip over birds for now. So we're going to talk about those big long neck dinosaurs, the sauropods. So they actually go in the same group. We don't see them during the Triassic. They really arise during, I believe, the mid-Jurassic and then continue into the Cretaceous until they go extinct along with basically all of our dinosaurs except for our avian dinosaurs, the birds. So you can see that the distribution is pretty similar to our theropods, probably in part because of which fossil sites are good. But that time period is a little different there. So our sauropod dinosaurs, here we can see the Sauropodomorpha, are splitting off from our theropods. Presumably the split happened sometime in the Triassic, but we don't see them becoming prevalent until we really start to see sauropod fossils in the Jurassic, kind of moving forward. So they're characterized by really long necks, long tails to match, columnar legs below them. They get really big. They were, however, herbivores. So we can think of them as potentially acting kind of like modern day giraffes do, a long neck for grazing and for reaching farther so that they were able to reach more leaves, maybe reach more young and tender leaves, right, at growing tips of plants. The earliest ones we find are more in Africa, our very earliest groups. So that's kind of a new fossil location compared to where we were looking at our theropods. So we can think of them as kind of looking like elephants with this specialization of having a long neck as an addition. So I don't know, like some elephant giraffe-like creature, because of these long columnar legs that go right below them. So they're returning to a quadrupedal state. So our other dinosaurs to this point have been bipedal, so they've been up on their two hind legs with short little forelimbs. As the sauropods get really large, they really start to weight support on all four limbs right below them. And they don't need those forelimbs for grasping prey. They're using their long neck in their mouth for getting leaves. They're not doing much fighting here. And in general, we see lots of adaptations for herbivory, so eating plants in our sauropods. We'll use this picture on the bottom first. Okay, so really long backbones. So we've got a long neck and we have a tail with like 70 to 80 vertebrae. So matching very long, large tail. Okay, so it's not like stiff and whip-like we saw in the theropods, but it is elongated. Our back legs are still longer than the front, but much more equal in size than we saw in the theropods. The cool thing that we see is that they have gastroliths in the stomach. So basically they literally have rocks in their gut, helping them kind of churn through plant material as they digest it, break it up so that they can get nutrients from that material. Here we see that their teeth, while they still look pointy, when you're zoomed in, you can see that they're not really serrated like the theropods. They're actually much more blunt looking, even though they're still this general kind of oval. And I suspect we can also tell kind of from wear patterns a bit about what they were eating. They've got a lot of room for the gut in this central location. So we'll expect to see a really long gut, allowing for lots of processing of that vegetable matter that we're eating. And we can see big, strong limbs in both the forelimb and that hind limb. So we can see that we're really seeing adaptations for supporting that giant size and that giant amount of weight. We can still see those serration traits when we look there at the pelvis. A cool, or at least cool to me, aside about the sauropods is when I was a kid, I always thought that my favorite sauropod was Brontosaurus, but for a long time that was not actually thought to be a real dinosaur, because dinosaurs get named based on the first specimen that is found, right? Finders keepers, right? Whoever finds it first gets to name it. So this is one of the examples of where we have this kind of war between two names and two scientists. So Marsh was one of those two paleontologists who was out in the West trying to find as many dinosaurs as possible, name as many dinosaurs as possible, be as famous as possible. Okay. And basically he found two fossils in two different places and gave them different names. So early on, Brontosaurus became much more famous, but then analyses found that it was likely the same species as the Apatosaurus. So it's got these really more peg-like teeth from those ovals, long neck, columnar legs, lots of bulky body space for the gut, stones in its gut to grind food. Very recently, whether this is partially for emotional reasons, like maybe they were partially like trying to prove this, Brontosaurus has been revived as a valid taxon. So a team of paleontologists looked at lots more new fossils of the Apatosaurus and some things that were called Brontosaurus, and have made an argument that maybe these two groups really are different enough to be different species. So here where we find those fossils that we're talking about, whether or not they're different and both get to be grouped, not sure, but generally they're referring to the same kind of animal, which is a sauropod, and this is the kind of generic form for a sauropod. Okay. So we'll stop there and we'll talk about our ornithischians on Friday.